James Whitmore's horse had clawed at the same patch of prairie for 3 days, and when the rancher finally dug where Thunder insisted, his shovel struck a human skull. The body belonged to a cavalry officer's wife who vanished in 1881, and the evidence buried with her would expose a murder that had been protected by the United States Army for over 40 years. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming prairie as James Whitmore watched his horse behave in a way that made no sense whatsoever. Thunder, a 12-year-old bay gelding who had been his most reliable mount for nearly a decade, stood pawing at the same patch of ground he had been returning to for 3 days straight. The earth there looked different now, disturbed and strange, with loose soil scattered in a wide arc around a shallow depression that seemed to grow deeper each time James rode out to check the fence line. It started on Monday morning when James had saddled Thunder for the routine inspection of the eastern pasture boundary. The horse had been eager as always, responsive to every command, until they reached the old cottonwood stand about 2 miles from the ranch house. There, without warning or apparent cause, Thunder had stopped dead in his tracks and began pawing at the ground with his right front hoof. The behavior was so unusual that James had dismounted immediately, concerned the animal might have stepped on something sharp or picked up a stone in his shoe. But Thunder's hooves were clean, his legs sound, and there was nothing visible on the ground that might have caused distress. James had remounted and urged the horse forward, but Thunder remained fixated on that spot, his ears pricked forward with an intensity that spoke of something beyond mere stubbornness. After several minutes of coaxing, James had finally managed to complete his fence inspection, though the horse had turned back toward that patch of ground 3 times during the ride home, as if pulled by some invisible force. Tuesday brought more of the same peculiar behavior, but worse. Thunder refused his morning grain, something he had never done in all the years James had owned him. When they rode out to the pasture, the horse made a direct line for the cottonwood stand, moving with such determination that James let him have his head just to see what would happen. What happened was another session of intense digging, Thunder's powerful shoulders working as he scraped away layer after layer of prairie soil. By the time James pulled him away, the horse had created a depression nearly a foot deep and 3 feet across. That evening at dinner, James mentioned the situation to his wife Clara across their kitchen table. They had been married for 7 years, long enough that she could read the concern in his face even when he tried to hide it. Clara was a practical woman, the daughter of a horse trader from Kansas, and she knew animals as well as anyone in the territory. When he described Thunder's obsessive behavior, she set down her fork and looked at him with those clear gray eyes that had first caught his attention at a church social all those years ago. "Horses do not dig without reason," she said simply. "They are not dogs burying bones or children playing in dirt. If Thunder is digging in the same spot repeatedly, there is something there that he senses, something we cannot yet perceive." The observation had stayed with James through a restless night. Clara was right, of course. Horses were prey animals, creatures whose survival depended on acute awareness of their environment. Thunder was not a young, flighty colt prone to spooking at shadows. He was a seasoned ranch horse, calm and reliable, the kind of animal you could trust with your life on a treacherous mountain trail or during a sudden storm. If Thunder believed something important lay beneath that patch of ground, then James owed it to the animal to investigate further. Wednesday morning found James back at the cottonwood stand with a shovel strapped to his saddle and a growing sense of unease settling in his gut. The depression Thunder had created was now nearly 18 inches deep, and the disturbed earth around it spread in a rough circle about 5 feet in diameter. The ground here was different from the surrounding prairie. He realized now that he was looking more carefully. The soil was darker, richer, as if it had been worked at some point in the distant past. Vegetation grew differently too, the grass thicker and more lush in this specific area. Thunder pawed at the ground again with such vigor that James had to step back to avoid being struck by flying clods of earth. The horse's nostrils flared wide, his eyes showing white around the edges in a way that spoke of excitement rather than fear. James had seen that look before, but only when Thunder had found water during a particularly dry summer, his keen senses detecting moisture beneath the surface that no human could have perceived. But this was not about water. James was certain of that now as he knelt beside the depression and ran his weathered hands through the loose soil. Something was different about this place, something that called to Thunder's instincts and was beginning to call to James's own growing curiosity. He thought about the history of this land, about the generations who had lived and died on these prairies long before white settlers arrived. He thought about the old-timers in town who sometimes spoke in hushed voices about things found buried on remote ranches, about secrets the earth kept for decades before yielding them up to those brave or foolish enough to dig. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when James made his decision. Tomorrow he would bring Clara out here, show her what Thunder had found, or rather what Thunder was convinced needed to be found. Together they would excavate this mysterious spot and discover what lay beneath the prairie soil. Whatever it was, James had a feeling it would change everything. The horse knew something, and James Whitmore had learned long ago never to ignore what his animals were trying to tell him. Thursday morning arrived with a crispness that promised autumn was finally asserting itself over the Wyoming plains. Clara stood at their bedroom window watching the sun paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill that had settled into the house overnight. James was already up. She could hear him moving around downstairs, the familiar sounds of coffee being prepared and boots being pulled on with determined purpose. He had barely slept, tossing and turning beside her, his mind clearly occupied with Thunder's strange behavior and what it might mean. She dressed quickly in her practical riding clothes, a split skirt of sturdy brown wool and a cotton blouse that had seen better days but remained serviceable for ranch work. Her mother had been horrified when Clara first adopted men's style riding, insisting that proper ladies rode side saddle regardless of the impracticality. But Clara had left proper Eastern sensibilities behind in Kansas, choosing instead the freedom and safety that came with being able to control a horse properly in rough country. Out here, practicality trumped propriety every time, and any woman who thought otherwise usually learned that lesson the hard way. Downstairs, James had already packed supplies for their expedition: 2 shovels, a pickaxe, rope, canteens of water, and sandwiches wrapped in brown paper sat in neat piles on the kitchen table. He looked up as she entered, his blue eyes reflecting the same mixture of excitement and apprehension she felt stirring in her own chest. They had built this life together from nothing, claiming their homestead 7 years ago when this part of Wyoming was still considered too wild, too remote for civilized folk. They had survived harsh winters, drought summers, and all the challenges that came with carving out an existence on the frontier. Whatever Thunder had found, they would face it together. The ride to the cottonwood stand took nearly an hour at an easy pace, with Thunder leading the way, as if he knew exactly where they were headed. Clara rode her own mount, a gentle mare named Willow, and watched with growing fascination as Thunder moved with unmistakable purpose across the prairie. The horse's ears remained pricked forward, his stride lengthening as they drew closer to the sight, and she could see the tension building in his powerful frame. This was not the behavior of an animal acting on whim or confusion. This was directed, intentional, driven by instincts that reached back thousands of years to a time when horses survived by trusting their senses absolutely. When they reached the disturbed ground, Clara dismounted and approached the depression with the careful attention she had learned from her father. The old man had been able to read land the way some people read books, seeing stories written in the lay of the earth, the growth of vegetation, the way water moved and settled. She had inherited some of that gift, and what she saw here troubled her in ways she could not immediately articulate. The soil was wrong somehow, layered in patterns that spoke of human intervention rather than natural settling. "James," she said quietly, kneeling beside the hole Thunder had created. "Look at this." She pointed to distinct strata visible in the exposed earth, lighter and darker bands that suggested the ground had been excavated and refilled at some point in the past. "And here, see how the grass grows differently? This area was disturbed long ago, maybe 20 or 30 years, and the vegetation has been trying to reclaim it ever since." James knelt beside her, his calloused hands sifting through the loose soil with practiced ease. His father had been a miner in Colorado before settling down to ranch life, and he had taught James to read earth composition the way Clara's father had taught her to read land patterns. Together, they made a formidable team, their combined knowledge painting a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Something substantial had been buried here, something large enough to require significant excavation and careful concealment. Thunder pawed at the ground again, more insistently this time, and Clara noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. The horse was not randomly digging. His hoof was striking the same spot repeatedly, a specific location roughly in the center of the depression. She stood and moved to where Thunder indicated, then knelt again and began carefully removing loose soil with her bare hands. James joined her without a word, both of them working in synchronized silence born of years of partnership. 3 inches down, Clara's fingers encountered something that was definitely not rock or root. She paused, her heart suddenly hammering in her chest, and exchanged a meaningful glance with her husband. James retrieved one of the shovels and began working more carefully, removing thin layers of earth with the precision of an archaeologist rather than the efficiency of a rancher. Clara used her hands to clear away the finer particles, and slowly, incrementally, a shape began to emerge from the prairie soil. It was fabric, she realized with growing shock. Old fabric, rotted and stained, but still recognizable as woven material rather than any natural substance. The color was impossible to determine after so long underground, but the texture suggested wool or possibly canvas, something heavy and durable that had been meant to last. James stopped digging and sat back on his heels, his face pale beneath its weathered tan. Clara felt her own stomach churning with apprehension as the implications of their discovery began to crystallize in her mind. This was not treasure. This was not some forgotten cache of supplies or abandoned trade goods. The size and shape of what they were uncovering, the way it had been carefully buried and concealed, the deliberate nature of the interment, all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. They had found a grave. Thunder had led them to someone's final resting place, hidden beneath the prairie for decades, undiscovered and unmarked until a horse's keen instincts had detected something amiss with the earth itself. Clara looked at James and saw her own mixture of horror and fascination reflected in his expression. They were simple ranchers, not lawmen or undertakers, certainly not investigators trained to deal with whatever story this grave might tell. But they had started this excavation, and Thunder's insistent behavior suggested they were meant to finish it. Whatever secrets lay buried in this lonely spot beneath the cottonwoods, they were about to be revealed after years of patient waiting in the dark earth. "Should we continue?" Clara asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. James nodded slowly, his jaw set with the determination she had seen countless times when faced with difficult but necessary tasks. "We have to," he replied simply. "Whoever this is, they deserve to be found. They deserve to have their story told." They worked for another 2 hours, moving earth with the reverence of people who understood they were disturbing a sacred place. The sun climbed higher in the Wyoming sky, warming the air, but doing nothing to dispel the chill that had settled into Clara's bones as more of the burial site revealed itself. The fabric they had first encountered was part of a larger wrapping, something that had once been carefully folded around whatever lay beneath, but had deteriorated over the years into fragmentary remnants that tore at the slightest touch. James worked with methodical precision, his mining background evident in the way he approached the excavation. He dug around the perimeter first, creating a working space that allowed them to expose the grave without disturbing its contents more than necessary. Clara found herself thinking about the person who had done this original digging, imagining them standing in this same spot decades ago, sweating under the same prairie sun, carefully lowering their burden into the earth and covering it with the same soil she and James were now removing. The grave was deeper than she had expected, nearly 4 feet down, which suggested someone had taken considerable time and effort to ensure proper burial. That detail troubled her almost as much as the grave's existence itself. This was not a hasty concealment, not some criminal trying to hide evidence of wrongdoing. This was a deliberate interment, done with care and possibly even ceremony. Yet there was no marker, no indication that anyone was meant to find this place again. The contradiction nagged at her as she helped James clear away the last layers of soil. Thunder had moved away from the excavation site and stood beneath the cottonwoods, his head hanging low as if the effort of leading them here had exhausted something essential in him. Clara noticed that the horse would not look directly at the grave, his eyes fixed instead on the distant horizon where the prairie met the sky in an endless line of possibility. Animals knew things, her father had always insisted. They sensed death and tragedy in ways humans had forgotten, their instincts still sharp from millennia of surviving in a dangerous world. By midday, they had exposed the grave completely. What lay before them was unmistakably a body, wrapped in what had once been a heavy wool blanket, but was now little more than disintegrating threads, clinging to bones that had been claimed by time and earth. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at the skeletal remains, thinking about the life this person had lived, the dreams they had held, the people who must have mourned their passing. Someone had loved this person enough to bury them with care, even if they could not mark the grave for reasons that remained mysterious. James stood slowly, his joints creaking from the prolonged kneeling, and removed his hat in a gesture of respect. "We should say something," he said quietly. "It does not feel right to disturb them without at least acknowledging their humanity." Clara nodded and bowed her head, searching for words that felt adequate to the moment. She was not particularly religious, though they attended church when weather and work allowed, but she believed in the dignity of the dead and the obligation the living owed to those who had come before. "Rest in peace," she said softly. "Whoever you were, wherever you came from, you are not forgotten. We will see that you are treated with the respect you deserve." The words seemed to hang in the air above the grave, and Clara felt a strange sense of release, as if something that had been waiting patiently for acknowledgement had finally received it. Thunder lifted his head from his resting position and nickered softly, the sound carrying across the prairie with surprising clarity. "They needed to notify the authorities," James said, settling his hat back on his head. "The sheriff in Clearwater would want to know about this. There will be questions about who this person was and how they came to be buried here." Clara agreed, though she felt a strange reluctance to bring official attention to their discovery. This felt private somehow, intimate in a way that would be violated by strangers tramping through with their procedures and protocols. But James was right. The law required notification when human remains were discovered, and they were not equipped to determine important details like how long the person had been dead or whether foul play had been involved. As she helped James begin covering the grave again with loose soil, enough to protect it but not enough to rebury it completely, Clara noticed something that made her pause. There was a depression in the earth at what would have been the head of the grave, a small hollow that had not been created by their digging. She knelt and carefully explored the space with her fingers, feeling something hard and smooth beneath a thin layer of dirt. Her breath caught as she pulled the object free and held it up to the sunlight. It was a locket, tarnished silver that had somehow survived the decades underground. The chain was broken, explaining why it had separated from the body, but the locket itself remained intact, its oval shape familiar and heartbreaking in its ordinariness. This was the kind of piece that women treasured, that they wore close to their hearts and passed down through generations. The fact that it had been buried with its owner suggested either deep sentiment or perhaps circumstances that prevented its removal before burial. "James," Clara called softly, and he immediately came to her side. Her hands trembled slightly as she attempted to open the locket, the clasp stiff and resistant after so long in the earth. It took several careful attempts, but finally the mechanism gave way and the locket sprang open to reveal what lay inside. Two photographs, remarkably well preserved thanks to the sealed interior, stared up at them from the past. One showed a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold both hope and sadness in their captured gaze. The other photograph was of a man in a military uniform, his face stern and proud, the insignia visible even in the faded image identifying him as a cavalry officer. "This changes everything," James said quietly. "This suggests a story more complicated than a simple burial." The locket was expensive, well made, the kind of thing that indicated some wealth or at least comfortable circumstances. Combined with the military connection, it painted a picture that did not fit with an unmarked grave in the middle of nowhere. Clara studied the woman's face, feeling an unexpected connection across the years. There was intelligence in those eyes, a determination that Clara recognized from her own reflection. This had been someone who mattered, someone whose life had significance beyond her final resting place in the prairie soil. "We need to find out who she was," Clara said firmly. "Before we bring in the authorities and this becomes an official investigation, we need to understand her story. She deserves to have someone care about the truth, not just process her as another unsolved mystery." James looked at his wife with the admiration that had never faded in their 7 years together. "You want to investigate ourselves?" She met his gaze steadily. "Thunder brought us here for a reason. Maybe that reason is not just to find a grave, but to give this woman back her identity and her dignity. Maybe we are meant to solve this mystery." The ride back to the ranch house felt longer than the journey out, weighted by the locket that Clara carried carefully in her pocket and the questions that multiplied with each mile. James rode beside her in thoughtful silence, his eyes occasionally drifting to the horizon, as if searching for answers written in the landscape itself. Thunder walked with his head low, the strange urgency that had driven him for days finally satisfied now that his humans had found what he had been trying to show them. Whatever instinct or awareness had compelled the horse to dig at that particular spot seemed to have quieted, leaving behind only the typical steady rhythm of a ranch horse heading home after a day's work. When they reached the house, Clara went immediately to the kitchen and carefully cleaned the locket with soft cloth and gentle soap, revealing details that had been obscured by decades of tarnish and soil. The craftsmanship was exceptional, she noted, with delicate filigree work around the edges and what appeared to be a jeweler's mark on the back. She used James's magnifying glass to examine the tiny stamp, making out the letters H and B intertwined in an ornate monogram. That detail might prove useful if they could locate a jeweler who recognized the mark or had records going back far enough. The photographs themselves were clearer now that the locket was clean, and Clara found herself drawn repeatedly to the young woman's face. There was something hauntingly familiar about her features, though Clara could not place why. The image captured a moment of formal stillness, as all photographs of that era did, but there was life behind those eyes, personality that had somehow survived the technical limitations and the passage of time. The woman wore a high-collared dress with delicate lace at the throat, and her hair was styled in a fashion that Clara remembered seeing in old photographs from the 1870s or early 80s. The military officer's photograph was equally revealing in its details. His uniform was United States Cavalry. That much was certain from the distinctive insignia and the style of dress coat. The rank insignia, visible on his collar, suggested he had been a captain, a position of considerable responsibility and standing. His face was handsome in a stern way, with a strong jaw and eyes that stared directly at the camera with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. There was something protective in the way he held himself, even in a static photograph, as if he were standing guard over something precious. James returned from tending the horses and found Clara at the kitchen table, the locket open before her and papers spread around her as she made notes. She had written down everything they knew so far, creating columns for facts, assumptions, and questions. The facts were few, the assumptions numerous, and the questions endless. They knew the grave was at least 20 years old, based on the condition of the remains and the style of burial. They knew the woman had been wealthy enough to own a quality locket. They knew she had some connection to a cavalry officer. Beyond that, everything was speculation. "We should start at the county records office," James suggested, pulling up a chair beside his wife. "If she died around here, there might be a death certificate or burial record. Even if the grave was unmarked, someone might have filed paperwork." Clara nodded, though she felt doubtful that official records would reveal much. The unmarked nature of the grave suggested a deliberate attempt to keep the burial secret, and people who went to such lengths rarely filed official documentation. Still, it was a logical place to begin, and they needed to be methodical if they were going to uncover the truth. The next morning, they made the journey to Clearwater, the county seat located 15 miles south of their ranch. The town was larger than their own settlement, boasting a proper courthouse, several churches, and enough businesses to serve the surrounding ranching community. The county clerk's office occupied the ground floor of the courthouse, a stuffy room filled with leather-bound record books and the musty smell of old paper. The clerk, a thin man named Horace Pembroke who wore spectacles perched precariously on his narrow nose, looked up with barely concealed annoyance as they entered. "We are looking for death records from the 1870s and 80s, James explained, removing his hat respectfully. "Any young women who might have died in this area during that time period." Pembroke's expression shifted from annoyance to curiosity. "That is a broad search. Do you have any more specific information? A name, perhaps, or a specific year?" "We have reason to believe she had connections to the military," Clara added, "possibly married to or associated with a cavalry officer stationed at Fort Sanders or one of the other posts in the territory." The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly, and Clara saw recognition flicker in his eyes. "Fort Sanders was decommissioned in 1882, he said slowly. "Most of the records from that period were transferred to territorial archives in Cheyenne. But I remember my predecessor mentioning something odd from around that time." He moved to one of the tall bookcases that lined the walls and began searching through volumes, his finger tracing along spines until he found what he sought. "Here," Pembroke said, pulling down a heavy ledger and laying it on the counter. "This is a personal journal kept by my predecessor, Samuel Crane. He was clerk here for 40 years and had a habit of recording notable events that did not fit neatly into official records." The clerk opened the journal and paged through entries written in cramped, precise handwriting. Here it is. In the spring of 1881, there was considerable gossip in Clearwater about a young woman who had disappeared from Fort Sanders. Wife of a Captain Lawrence Brennan, if I'm reading this correctly. Clara felt her pulse quicken. What happened to her? According to this, Pembroke continued reading carefully, the official story was that she had left her husband and returned east to family. But Mr. Crane noted that several people found that explanation suspicious. The woman, whose first name was Eleanor, had been well liked at the fort. She had no family back east that anyone knew of, having been orphaned as a child. Moreover, she had left all her belongings behind, which struck people as odd behavior for someone planning a permanent departure. James leaned forward intently. Was there any investigation? The clerk shook his head. Captain Brennan was transferred shortly after his wife's disappearance, reassigned to a post in Arizona Territory. By the time questions were being raised, he was long gone, and the matter was quietly forgotten. Fort Sanders closed the following year, and most of the people who had known Eleanor Brennan scattered to other posts or civilian life. The story simply faded away, as uncomfortable stories often do. Clara pulled the locket from her pocket and opened it, showing the photographs to Pembroke. Could this be Eleanor Brennan? The clerk studied the images carefully, then crossed to a filing cabinet and withdrew a folder. Inside were various documents related to Fort Sanders, including a group photograph of officers and their wives taken at some formal occasion. He pointed to a woman in the front row, and Clara felt a shock of recognition. The face was the same as the one in the locket, allowing for the differences in photographic quality and angle. That is Eleanor Brennan, Pembroke confirmed. And that, he indicated the officer standing behind her with his hand possessively on her shoulder, is Captain Lawrence Brennan. Clara looked at the man's face in the group photograph and then at the individual portrait in the locket. They were not the same person. The man in Eleanor's locket was someone else entirely, someone she had cared enough about to wear his picture next to her heart. The implications were staggering and painted a picture of secrets, forbidden love, and quite possibly murder. The revelation hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Clara stared at the two photographs, comparing the stern face of Captain Lawrence Brennan in the group portrait with the softer, younger features of the unknown officer in Eleanor's locket. The differences were unmistakable once you looked carefully. The man Eleanor had carried close to her heart was not her husband, and that single fact transformed their discovery from a sad mystery into something far more sinister. James asked Pembroke if he could make inquiries about other officers stationed at Fort Sanders during that period, specifically anyone who might have been close to the Brennan family. The clerk hesitated, clearly torn between his duty to maintain confidentiality and his growing fascination with the unfolding mystery. Finally, his curiosity won out, and he disappeared into the back rooms of the courthouse, returning 15 minutes later with another ledger and several loose papers that smelled of mildew and age. According to the fort's roster from 1880 to 82, Pembroke said, spreading the documents across the counter, there were approximately 30 officers stationed there at various times. Most were married, as the fort encouraged officers to bring their families as a civilizing influence on the frontier. He ran his finger down the list of names, pausing occasionally to consult his notes. Captain Brennan was second in command to Colonel Whitfield during that period. His immediate subordinates included 3 lieutenants and 2 junior captains. Clara studied the names, but without photographs or descriptions, they were just words on paper, meaningless without context. Is there any way to determine which of these officers might have been particularly close to the Brennan household? She asked. Perhaps someone who visited frequently or was known to be friendly with Mrs. Brennan. Pembroke frowned thoughtfully, then pulled out another document, this one a letter written on official military stationery. This might be relevant, he said. It is a formal complaint filed by Captain Brennan in January of 1881, 2 months before his wife's disappearance. He accused Lieutenant Thomas Hardwick of conduct unbecoming an officer, specifically citing inappropriate attention toward Mrs. Brennan. James and Clara exchanged meaningful glances. That sounded promising, perhaps even damning. What happened with the complaint? James asked. According to the notation here, Pembroke replied, the matter was investigated by Colonel Whitfield and dismissed for lack of evidence. Lieutenant Hardwick was transferred to Fort Laramie shortly thereafter, Though the records do not indicate whether the transfer was punitive or routine, the timing certainly suggested cause and effect, even if the official records maintained a careful neutrality. "Do you have any information about Lieutenant Hardwick?" Clara pressed. "Anything that might help us locate him or learn more about his connection to Eleanor Brennan?" The clerk shook his head regretfully. "Military personnel records are kept by the War Department in Washington. I only have what was filed locally, and that is primarily administrative." "However," he added after a moment's consideration, "there is someone in town who might remember more details." Abigail Saunders was a laundress at Fort Sanders during that period. She still lives here in Clearwater, runs a boarding house on 3rd Street. If there was gossip about the officers and their wives, she would have heard it. They found Abigail Saunders's boarding house an hour later, a tidy 2-story structure painted cheerful yellow with white trim and window boxes full of autumn flowers. The woman who answered their knock was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. When James explained they were researching the history of Fort Sanders, specifically the events of 1881, her expression shifted from polite interest to wary caution. "That was a long time ago," she said carefully. "Most of those people are dead now. Why bring up old troubles?" Clara pulled out the locket and opened it, showing Mrs. Saunders the photographs. "We believe this woman was Eleanor Brennan. We found her buried on our property, unmarked and forgotten. She deserves to have her story told, to have justice if justice is warranted." The older woman's face paled as she looked at the images, and her hand came up to clutch at her throat. "Sweet, merciful heaven," she whispered. "After all these years." She stepped back and gestured for them to enter. "You had better come in. This is not a conversation for the front porch." Mrs. Saunders led them to a comfortable parlor and settled into an armchair with the weary movement of someone whose memories were suddenly too heavy to carry standing. "I knew Eleanor," she said quietly. "Everyone at the fort knew her. She was kind and gentle, always had a smile for the enlisted men's children, always treated us laundresses like we were real people instead of just servants. She deserved better than what she got. Better than Lawrence Brennan, certainly." "What was Captain Brennan like?" James asked, settling on the edge of the sofa with his hat in his hands. Mrs. Saunders's expression hardened. "He was a cruel man, though he hid it well in public. I saw the bruises Eleanor tried to conceal, heard her crying in their quarters when she thought no one was near. He was jealous and possessive, flew into rages if she so much as smiled at another officer. The fort commander knew, but did nothing. Those were different times, and what happened between a man and his wife was considered private business." "And Lieutenant Hardwick?" Clara prompted gently. The older woman's face softened immediately. "Thomas Hardwick was everything Lawrence Brennan was not. Gentle, kind, respectful. He and Eleanor fell in love, though they tried to hide it. Everyone knew anyway. You could see it in the way they looked at each other during social gatherings, the way she lit up when he entered a room. It was the kind of love that comes once in a lifetime, and it was wasted on a situation that could never have a happy ending." Mrs. Saunders stood and moved to a small writing desk, withdrawing an envelope from one of the drawers. "Eleanor gave me this a week before she disappeared," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She made me promise to keep it safe and only open it if something happened to her. When the story came out that she had left her husband and returned east, I did not believe it for a moment. But I was just a laundress who would have listened to me. I kept the letter sealed all these years, waiting for someone to ask the right questions." Clara took the envelope with trembling hands. The paper was yellowed with age, the seal broken now by Mrs. Saunders's careful opening. Inside was a single sheet covered in flowing feminine script. Clara read aloud so James could hear, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "My dearest friend, The letter began. If you are reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and Lawrence has discovered the truth about Thomas and myself. I want you to know that whatever happens, I do not regret loving Thomas. He showed me what marriage should be, what partnership and respect truly mean. My only regret is that we waited too long to act, that we let fear and propriety trap us in an impossible situation. The letter continued with specific details about Captain Brennan's increasingly violent behavior and his explicit threats about what he would do if Eleanor ever tried to leave him. She described a plan she and Lieutenant Hardwick had made to run away together, to start a new life somewhere far from the Army and the rigid social structures that bound them. They were supposed to leave on March 15, 1881. Instead, Eleanor had disappeared on March 10th, 5 days before their planned escape. Lawrence knows, the letter concluded. I saw it in his eyes last night when he came home early and found Thomas leaving our quarters. We had been saying goodbye. Nothing improper, but the look on Lawrence's face was murderous. I am writing this as insurance, as evidence in case something happens to me. Thomas tried to convince me to leave immediately, but I told him we should stick to our plan. I pray I have not made a terrible mistake. If I have, please tell Thomas that I loved him until the very end, and I hope he finds happiness even if I cannot share it with him. The room fell silent as Clara finished reading. Mrs. Saunders was weeping quietly, tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. I should have shown this to someone years ago, she said, but I was afraid. Captain Brennan was a powerful man with powerful friends. Who would have believed a laundress accusing an officer of murder? James and Clara left Abigail Saunders's boarding house with Eleanor's letter carefully secured in Clara's satchel, and a growing sense of urgency about their investigation. The evidence was mounting, painting a picture of jealous rage and calculated murder that had gone unpunished for over 20 years. But evidence from the past, no matter how compelling, would be difficult to prosecute without living witnesses or official corroboration. They needed to find Lieutenant Thomas Hardwick, assuming he was still alive, and they needed to determine what had happened to Captain Lawrence Brennan after his transfer to Arizona Territory. The Territorial Archives in Cheyenne were their next destination, a journey that would take 2 days by wagon, but was necessary if they wanted access to complete military records. Clara spent the evening preparing for the trip, packing supplies and arranging for their neighbor's son to look after the ranch and the animals while they were gone. James cleaned and oiled their rifles, a precaution that Clara understood was about more than just general frontier safety. If Captain Brennan was still alive, if he learned they were investigating his wife's murder, they might find themselves in considerable danger. They left before dawn the next morning, the wagon loaded with camping gear and enough provisions for a week. The road to Cheyenne was well-traveled but rough, cutting across prairie that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. Thunder was tied behind the wagon, and Clara noticed the horse remained unusually alert, his ears constantly swiveling as if listening for something only he could hear. The animal had led them to Eleanor's grave for a reason, and Clara could not shake the feeling that their investigation was being guided by forces beyond simple human curiosity. The journey gave them time to talk through what they knew and what they still needed to discover. James was convinced that Captain Brennan had killed his wife in a rage when he discovered her plans to leave with Hardwick. The unmarked grave on what was now their property suggested he had buried her in secret, perhaps with the help of 1 or 2 trusted enlisted men who could be counted on to keep quiet. The question was whether Brennan had also tried to kill Hardwick, or whether the lieutenant had simply been transferred away before he could ask too many questions about Eleanor's disappearance. Clara's thoughts kept returning to the letter, and Eleanor's final words about hoping Thomas would find happiness. There was such resignation in that phrase, such acceptance that her own happiness was impossible. It made Clara think about her own marriage to James, built on genuine affection and mutual respect. They had their disagreements, certainly, their difficult moments, but she had never feared him, never had to conceal bruises or walk carefully to avoid triggering violent rage. The contrast between her life and Eleanor's made her grateful and angry in equal measure. They reached Cheyenne on the afternoon of the second day, tired and dusty from the journey. The Territorial Archives were housed in a large brick building near the capital, staffed by a small army of clerks who maintained records for the entire Wyoming territory. James had sent a telegram ahead explaining their research needs, and they were greeted by a senior archivist named Margaret Walsh, a formidable woman in her 50s who had the air of someone who considered historical records to be sacred trusts. Mrs. Walsh led them to a private reading room and returned 20 minutes later with several boxes of documents related to Fort Sanders and its personnel. Military service records are typically confidential, she explained, but these men have been out of service for decades, and most are deceased. I see no harm in allowing you access for legitimate historical research. She paused, her sharp eyes studying them carefully. Though I suspect your interest is more personal than purely academic. Clara decided honesty was the best approach and explained about finding Eleanor's grave and the evidence suggesting she had been murdered by her husband. Mrs. Walsh listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grim. When Clara finished, the archivist sat back in her chair and removed her spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief as she considered what she had heard. I remember hearing stories about Fort Sanders when I first came to Wyoming, she said slowly. There were rumors of corruption, of officers who abused their power and were protected by the command structure. Nothing was ever proven, but the rumors persisted. She replaced her spectacles and opened the first box, pulling out personnel files for both Captain Brennan and Lieutenant Hardwick. Lawrence Brennan's record showed a military career that had been undistinguished but adequate. He had graduated from West Point in the middle of his class, served competently in various frontier posts, and retired with the rank of major in 1893. The file listed his last known address as Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he had apparently settled after leaving the service. There was a notation that he had died in 1902 of heart failure, a widower with no children. Lieutenant Hardwick's file told a very different story. After his transfer to Fort Laramie in February of 1881, he had served there for only 2 months before resigning his commission abruptly in May of that same year. The resignation had been accepted without question, suggesting that his superior officers were eager to see him gone. After leaving the Army, he had disappeared from official records entirely. There was no pension file, no forwarding address, nothing to indicate what had become of him after he walked away from his military career. That is unusual, Mrs. Walsh commented. Most officers who resigned their commissions stayed in touch with former colleagues, maintained some connection to military society. For someone to simply vanish suggests either a deliberate desire to avoid contact or possibly something more sinister. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. You think Brennan might have killed him too? It is possible, the archivist replied, or Hardwick may have feared for his life and gone into hiding. If he suspected what had happened to Eleanor, if he tried to investigate or make accusations, he would have made himself a target. James asked if there were any other records that might shed light on the situation, and Mrs. Walsh produced another file, this one containing correspondence between Fort Sanders and Territorial Headquarters. Buried among routine reports and requisition requests was a letter from Colonel Whitfield to the Territorial Governor, dated April of 1881, expressing concern about tensions among his officer corps and requesting permission to reorganize his command structure. The letter was carefully worded, but between the lines Clara could read a commander who knew something was seriously wrong but felt powerless to address it directly. There was also a brief investigative report filed by a civilian deputy marshal who had been asked to look into Eleanor Brennan's disappearance at the request of some concerned citizens at Fort Sanders. The deputy had interviewed Captain Brennan, who provided letters purportedly from Eleanor to her husband, explaining that she had left him and returned to live with relatives in Ohio. The deputy had attempted to verify this by contacting authorities in Ohio, but had received no response before Fort Sanders was closed and the matter was dropped. The investigation had concluded with a notation that Mrs. Brennan had the right to leave her husband if she chose, and that no crime appeared to have been committed. Of course there were no relatives in Ohio, Clara said bitterly. Eleanor was an orphan, according to what we learned from Mrs. Saunders. Those letters were forgeries, another part of Brennan's cover-up. Mrs. Walsh nodded grimly. I suspect you are correct. The question now is whether you can prove it after all these years, and whether proving it will serve any useful purpose given that the primary suspect is dead. Clara sat in the archives reading room long after Mrs. Walsh had excused herself for the evening, studying the documents spread before her with the same focused intensity she had once applied to difficult passages in books. James had gone to secure lodging for the night, leaving her alone with the records and her thoughts. The gas lamps cast flickering shadows across the pages, and she found herself constructing timelines, drawing connections, trying to see the pattern that would explain not just Eleanor's death, but also Thomas Hardwick's disappearance. The timing was significant. Hardwick had resigned his commission in May of 1881, just 2 months after Eleanor vanished. That suggested he had learned something or feared something serious enough to abandon a military career he had presumably worked years to build. Officers did not simply walk away from their commissions without compelling reason, especially not young men who had their whole careers ahead of them. Clara pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing down questions that needed answers. Where had Hardwick gone after leaving Fort Laramie? Had he tried to investigate Eleanor's disappearance? Had he confronted Brennan? Most importantly, was he still alive somewhere, carrying the truth about what happened to the woman he loved? James returned an hour later with news that he had found them rooms at a respectable hotel and had also made an interesting discovery. While securing their lodging, he had struck up a conversation with the hotel proprietor, mentioning their research into Fort Sanders' history. The proprietor, a talkative man named Frederick Chen, whose family had run laundries for the various military installations, remembered hearing his father speak about a young cavalry officer who had caused quite a stir by resigning suddenly and leaving the territory in the middle of the night. According to Chen's father, James explained, settling into the chair beside Clara, this officer had come to their laundry in Laramie asking questions about Captain Brennan and his wife. He wanted to know if anyone had seen Mrs. Brennan, if there were rumors about what had happened to her. Chen's father told him that laundry workers heard everything but said nothing, advice the young officer apparently ignored. A week later, the officer resigned and disappeared. Chen's father always believed the man had either been threatened into silence or had met with an unfortunate accident. Clara felt her pulse quicken. Did Mr. Chen know where the officer went? James shook his head. His father never knew for certain, but he remembered the officer asking about routes to Colorado and whether it was possible to travel south without being noticed. That suggests Hardwick was running from something or someone, trying to cover his tracks. They discussed the implications late into the night, sitting in their hotel room with Eleanor's locket between them on the small table. If Hardwick had gone to Colorado, there might be records there, some trace of his passage or eventual settlement. Colorado had been booming in the 1880s with mining operations and railroad construction, the kind of chaotic growth where a man could lose himself if he wanted to badly enough. The next morning, they returned to the archives with a new focus. Mrs. Walsh helped them search through territorial newspapers from the spring of 1881, looking for any mention of Hardwick or unexplained deaths that might have been covered up as accidents. They found nothing definitive, but Clara noticed something interesting in a brief article from a Laramie newspaper dated May 20th, 1881. It mentioned that a former cavalry officer named Thomas Hardwick had been seen boarding the southbound stage traveling light and asking the driver about opportunities in the Colorado mining towns. That was their first solid lead on Hardwick's movements after his resignation. Clara copied the article word for word, then asked Mrs. Walsh if the archives had any Colorado territorial records. The archivist smiled approvingly at Clara's thoroughness and produced several volumes of Colorado newspapers and mining company records. The search was painstaking, requiring hours of careful reading through dense columns of small print, but Clara's persistence paid off when she found an advertisement in a Denver newspaper from June of 1881. The advertisement was for an assayer's office opening in a mining camp called Silver Creek, located in the mountains west of Denver. The proprietor was listed as T.J. Hardwick, recently retired from military service and trained in mineralogy. Clara's hands trembled as she showed the advertisement to James. The initials matched, the timing was right, and assaying was a profession that would have been accessible to an educated former officer. It was not proof, but it was a strong possibility that they had found Thomas Hardwick's trail. Mrs. Walsh helped them locate Silver Creek on a map of Colorado. The mining camp had flourished briefly in the early 1880s, but had been abandoned by the turn of the century when the silver played out. However, the archivist noted that some of the buildings had been repurposed when a small ranching community established itself in the valley below the old camp. There might be old-timers there who remembered the boom days, who could confirm whether the assayer T.J. Hardwick was indeed the missing lieutenant. The decision to travel to Colorado was not made lightly. It would mean at least a week away from their ranch, additional expense, and no guarantee that they would find anything useful. But Clara felt a compelling obligation to Eleanor's memory and to the truth. This woman had been murdered, her body hidden in an unmarked grave, her death covered up by lies and official indifference. If there was any chance of finding the man she had loved, of learning the complete story, and perhaps finding some measure of justice, Clara was determined to pursue it. James studied his wife's determined expression and smiled with a mixture of admiration and resignation. "You are not going to let this go, are you?" "Never," Clara replied firmly. "Eleanor deserves better than to be forgotten. She deserves to have her story told. And Thomas Hardwick, if he is still alive, deserves to know that someone finally uncovered the truth about what happened to the woman he loved." They spent 2 more days in Cheyenne gathering information and supplies for the Colorado journey. Mrs. Walsh proved invaluable, providing them with letters of introduction to archivists and historical societies in Denver and suggesting people they might contact who specialized in Colorado mining history. The archivist also shared something personal on their last evening in Cheyenne. She told them about her own sister who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances 30 years earlier, a case that had never been solved and had haunted their family ever since. "What you are doing for Eleanor Brennan," Mrs. Walsh said quietly, "is what I wish someone had done for my sister, giving voice to the silenced, seeking justice for the forgotten. It matters more than you know, not just for the dead, but for those of us left behind wondering what really happened." Her words reinforced Clara's determination and gave deeper meaning to their investigation. This was about more than solving a historical mystery. It was about honoring the dignity of a woman whose life had been stolen and whose death had been concealed by those who should have protected her. The journey to Colorado would be long and potentially dangerous, crossing mountain passes and traveling through territory that was still rough, despite decades of settlement. But as they loaded their wagon and prepared for departure, Clara felt no hesitation. Thunder nickered softly from his position, tied behind the wagon, and she reached out to stroke his neck, silently thanking the horse for his persistent digging that had started them on this path. Whatever they found in Colorado, whatever truth awaited them in Silver Creek, they would face it together and see Eleanor's story through to its conclusion. The Rocky Mountains rose before them like a wall between earth and sky, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the advancing autumn. Clara had never seen anything quite like them, having spent her entire life on the plains where the horizon stretched flat and endless. The wagon road climbed steadily through pine forests and along cliff edges that made her stomach clench with anxiety, but James handled the reins with steady competence, talking softly to the horses as they navigated the treacherous switchbacks. They reached Silver Creek on the afternoon of their fourth day traveling from Denver. The town was smaller than Clara had expected, just a main street with perhaps 20 buildings in various states of repair. Most of the old mining camp structures higher up the mountain had collapsed or been reclaimed by the forest, but the valley settlement showed signs of modest prosperity. A general store, a church, a blacksmith shop, and several houses clustered together as if seeking comfort in proximity against the vast wilderness surrounding them. The proprietor of the general store, a weathered man in his 70s named Augustus Price, greeted them with the careful friendliness of someone who saw few strangers this late in the season. When James mentioned they were looking for information about the old mining days, specifically about an assayer named T.J. Hardwick, Price's expression shifted from friendly to guarded. "That is a name I have not heard spoken in many years," he said slowly. "What is your interest in Tom Hardwick?" Clara made a quick decision to trust the old man with at least part of their story. She explained that they were researching the history of Fort Sanders and had reason to believe Thomas Hardwick had information about events that occurred there in 1881. Price studied them both carefully, his faded blue eyes sharp with intelligence despite his age. Then he nodded as if coming to some internal decision. "Tom Hardwick was a good man," he said quietly. "Best assayer we ever had in this camp. Honest, fair in his dealings, never tried to cheat the miners the way some did. But he carried a sadness with him, a weight that never lifted no matter how many years passed." "Is he still alive?" James asked, and Clara held her breath, waiting for the answer. Price shook his head slowly. "Tom died 5 years ago, 1903. He was in his 60s by then, lived a quiet life after the mining camp closed. Moved down here to the valley, kept to himself mostly. He never married, never spoke about his past, though sometimes when he had too much whiskey in him, he would talk about a woman he had loved and lost." The disappointment was crushing, but Clara forced herself to focus on what they could still learn. Did Mr. Hardwick leave any papers, any records that might have survived? Price considered the question. He left everything to the church when he died, figuring the Reverend could sell what was useful and use the money for charity. Most of it was sold off, but I seem to recall there was a trunk of personal items that nobody wanted to buy. The Reverend stored it in the church basement, probably still there gathering dust. Nobody's had reason to look through it in 5 years. The church was a simple white structure at the end of the main street, well maintained despite the town's small size. Reverend Samuel Harding was a young man, perhaps 30, who had only been serving the Silver Creek community for 2 years. He listened to their story with growing interest and readily agreed to let them examine Hardwick's trunk. The church basement smelled of earth and old wood, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. The trunk sat in a corner beneath a dusty tarp, and when James pulled it into the light and opened the lid, Clara felt her heart begin to race. Inside were the accumulated possessions of a solitary life: books on mineralogy and assaying, a few items of clothing, some basic household goods. But beneath these ordinary items lay what they had come seeking: a leather satchel containing letters, photographs, and journals spanning more than 20 years. Clara's hands trembled as she opened the first journal, dated May of 1881. The entries were written in a strong masculine hand, and the pain in the words was palpable even across the decades. "I resigned my commission today," the first entry read. "I can no longer wear the uniform, knowing that it protects men like Lawrence Brennan, knowing that Eleanor is gone and no one will speak the truth about what happened to her. I went to Colonel Whitfield and told him I had evidence that Brennan murdered his wife. He looked at me with pity, and said that making such accusations without proof would destroy my career and accomplish nothing. He was right about the second part, but wrong about the first. I no longer care about my career. The entries continued, chronicling Hardwick's desperate attempt to investigate Eleanor's disappearance while still at Fort Laramie. He had questioned soldiers, interviewed civilians, tried to find anyone who had seen Eleanor after March 10th. But Brennan had been careful, covering his tracks with military precision. The few people who might have known something were either transferred, intimidated into silence, or simply disappeared themselves. Hardwick's frustration and grief were evident in every line, his love for Eleanor bleeding through the formal language of his journal entries. By late May, he had given up on official channels and decided to leave the Army entirely. "I will go where Brennan cannot reach me," he wrote. "I will build a new life far from the military and the corruption that allowed him to murder an innocent woman with impunity. But I will never forget Eleanor. I will carry her memory until my dying day, and someday, somehow, the truth will be known." The journals from subsequent years showed a man trying to find peace in his new life as an assayer. He wrote about the miners he met, the beauty of the mountains, the satisfaction of honest work. But threaded through every entry was the presence of Eleanor's ghost, the woman he had loved and lost, whose murder had gone unpunished. Clara found a separate bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and when she opened them, she recognized Eleanor's handwriting from the letter Mrs. Saunders had given them. These were love letters, passionate and heartbreaking, written in the months before Eleanor's death. She wrote about her dreams of a life with Thomas, about her fears regarding Lawrence's jealousy, about her determination to be brave enough to choose love over security. The final letter was dated March 9th, 1881, one day before she disappeared. "My darling Thomas," it read, "tomorrow I will tell Lawrence that I am leaving him. I know it is dangerous, but I cannot continue this deception any longer. By this time next week we will be free together at last, building the life we have dreamed of. Whatever happens, know that loving you has been the greatest joy of my life." But tomorrow had never come for Eleanor, and Thomas had spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of that lost future. Clara sat in the dim basement reading Eleanor's letters while tears tracked silently down her cheeks. The intimacy of the words, the hope and fear intertwined in every sentence, made Eleanor real in a way that skeletal remains never could. This had been a woman with dreams and courage, someone who had dared to choose love despite knowing the terrible risks. The tragedy of her death was magnified by these letters, by the future that had been stolen from both her and Thomas in a moment of jealous rage. James found something else in the trunk that made their discovery even more significant. Wrapped in oilcloth at the very bottom was a leather-bound book that appeared to be a detailed account of everything Thomas Hardwick had learned about Eleanor's disappearance. The title page read simply, "The Truth About Eleanor Brennan," written by Thomas J. Hardwick, May 1881. What followed was a methodical documentation of his investigation, names of people he had interviewed, descriptions of suspicious circumstances, and most importantly, a signed statement from a soldier named Private Daniel Murphy, who claimed to have helped Captain Brennan dispose of a body on the night of March 10th. Murphy's statement was devastating in its detail. He described how Captain Brennan had summoned him and another private, offering them money and promotion if they would help him with a sensitive matter and keep silent about it forever. The captain had claimed his wife had died suddenly of a fever and that he wanted to bury her quietly to avoid a scandal that might damage his career. Murphy had believed the story until they arrived at the Brennan quarters and saw Eleanor's body, her neck clearly showing marks of strangulation. The other private, a man named William Chase, had expressed doubts, but Brennan had threatened them both with court-martial and execution if they spoke a word about what they had seen. They had buried Eleanor in a remote location that Brennan selected, a spot beneath cottonwood trees far from the fort. Murphy's statement included a rough map showing the burial site, and when Clara compared it to the location where Thunder had been digging, the landmarks matched perfectly. This was proof, concrete evidence that could have convicted Lawrence Brennan of murder if it had been presented to the proper authorities. But Thomas Hardwick had never been able to use it. His account explained why in painful detail. Hardwick had confronted Colonel Whitfield with Murphy's statement and demanded an investigation. The colonel had listened carefully, then explained the political realities of frontier military justice. Captain Brennan came from a wealthy and influential family with connections in Washington. Murphy was a common soldier whose testimony could easily be discredited. Chase, the other witness, had already been transferred to a post in Texas and would likely deny everything rather than risk his career. Without a body, without additional witnesses, any attempt to bring charges would fail and would destroy everyone involved in making the accusation. The colonel had been sympathetic but firm. He had advised Hardwick to resign quietly and build a new life elsewhere, to let the matter rest, rather than pursuing a justice that would never come. Hardwick had followed that advice, but not before writing this account and preserving all his evidence. "One day the truth will matter," he had written in his conclusion. "One day someone will care enough to listen, to see Eleanor as more than just another woman who disappeared on the frontier. When that day comes, this record will speak for both of us." That day had finally arrived, more than 20 years after Thomas Hardwick's death and over 40 years after Eleanor's murder. Clara looked at James with fierce determination burning in her eyes. "We have to make this public. We have to tell Eleanor's story and expose what Brennan did, even if he is dead and beyond earthly justice. People need to know that she did not abandon her husband, that she was murdered for daring to seek happiness with a man who loved her." Reverend Harding had been listening quietly from the basement stairs, and now he descended to join them. "I agree completely," he said. "This story needs to be told, not just for Eleanor and Thomas, but for all the silenced voices of the past. We have a responsibility to bear witness to injustice, even injustice that occurred long ago." He suggested they take the trunk and all its contents back to Wyoming, where Eleanor was buried and where her story had the most relevance. The church would provide a letter authenticating the materials and confirming their provenance. They spent the rest of that day carefully documenting everything in the trunk, making lists and taking notes to ensure nothing was lost or misunderstood. Augustus Price from the general store stopped by the church and shared his own memories of Thomas Hardwick. "The man never seemed at peace," Price said. "He worked hard, was kind to everyone, but you could see the sorrow in him like a physical weight. Now I understand why. He was carrying the burden of Eleanor's death and the injustice of her murder for more than 20 years." That evening, Clara wrote a long letter to Mrs. Walsh at the Territorial Archives, describing everything they had discovered and asking for her help in making the story public. She also wrote to Abigail Saunders, knowing the older woman would want to know that Eleanor's fate had finally been uncovered and that the letter she had preserved all those years had proven crucial to revealing the truth. These women had been part of Eleanor's life or had helped preserve her memory, and they deserved to know that their faith in the truth had been vindicated. The journey back to Wyoming took 6 days, slowed by the precious cargo of Thomas Hardwick's trunk and the careful attention they paid to protecting its contents. Clara spent hours each evening reading through the journals and letters, absorbing the details of a love story that had ended in tragedy but had somehow survived in words and memories. She began to formulate a plan for how to honor Eleanor and Thomas, how to ensure their story would not be forgotten again. When they finally reached their ranch, Thunder greeted them with unusual excitement, nickering and tossing his head as if he understood that their journey had been successful. Clara walked out to the cottonwood stand where Eleanor's grave remained covered with the protective layer of soil they had replaced before leaving for Colorado. She stood there in the fading light and spoke to the woman buried beneath the prairie earth. "We know what happened to you now," she said quietly. "We know about your love for Thomas and his love for you. We know that you were brave enough to choose happiness despite the danger. Your story will be told, Eleanor Brennan. You will not be forgotten." James joined her at the gravesite, his arm coming around her shoulders in a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "What happens now?" he asked. Clara looked at him with the same determination that had driven their entire investigation. "Now we make sure everyone knows the truth. We write articles for the newspapers, we contact historians and journalists, we push for an official acknowledgement of what happened. Lawrence Brennan may be dead and beyond justice, but his crimes can still be exposed. Eleanor and Thomas deserve that much." The story of Eleanor Brennan's murder broke in the Clearwater Gazette 3 weeks later, written by Clara with assistance from Mrs. Walsh and verified by multiple historical sources. The article was picked up by newspapers throughout Wyoming and Colorado, then spread to publications across the country as the tale of forbidden love and frontier injustice captured public imagination. Clara had written it carefully, focusing on Eleanor as a person rather than just a victim, highlighting her courage and the love she had shared with Thomas Hardwick, despite the impossible circumstances that had trapped them both. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured into their ranch from descendants of Fort Sanders personnel, from historians studying frontier military culture, and from women who saw their own struggles reflected in Eleanor's story. Some letters came from people who had known Thomas Hardwick in his Colorado years, sharing memories of a quiet, sad man who had occasionally spoken of a lost love. One letter came from the grandson of Private Daniel Murphy, the soldier whose statement had provided crucial evidence of Brennan's crime. Murphy had carried the guilt of his silence until his death in 1907, and his family was grateful to finally understand the burden their ancestor had borne. The military was forced to acknowledge the case officially. Though Captain Brennan was long dead and beyond prosecution, the Army issued a formal statement expressing regret for the failure to properly investigate Eleanor's disappearance and the subsequent cover-up of evidence. It was a small gesture, inadequate to the magnitude of the injustice, but it represented official recognition that Eleanor's death had been murder and that the system had failed her catastrophically. Clara organized a proper burial ceremony for Eleanor, inviting everyone who had helped uncover the truth. Mrs. Saunders traveled from Clearwater, bringing flowers and the original letter Eleanor had entrusted to her. Mrs. Walsh came from Cheyenne with official documents certifying the historical importance of the case. Reverend Harding made the journey from Silver Creek, carrying a letter Thomas Hardwick had written years ago, expressing his wish that someday Eleanor would receive the dignified memorial she deserved. Augustus Price came too, representing the community that had known Thomas in his exile and had witnessed his unending grief. The ceremony took place on a brilliant October morning beneath the cottonwood trees, where Thunder had first begun his persistent digging. Eleanor's remains had been carefully exhumed by a professional undertaker and placed in a proper coffin, though Clara had insisted on keeping the locket and Eleanor's letters with the body as they had been found. A stone monument had been commissioned, paid for by donations from people across the territory who had been moved by Eleanor's story. The inscription read simply, "Eleanor Brennan, 1857 to 1881. Beloved by Thomas Hardwick. Silenced by violence, remembered by truth." Reverend Harding conducted the service, reading passages that spoke of love and justice and the ultimate triumph of truth over deception. He read excerpts from Eleanor's letters with Clara's permission, letting her own words testify to the life she had lived and the love she had chosen. When it came time for personal remembrances, Mrs. Saunders spoke through tears about the kind young woman who had treated laundresses with dignity when others had looked through them as if they were invisible. Clara spoke about the responsibility of the living to honor the dead, by seeking truth regardless of how much time had passed or how powerful the forces arrayed against justice. As they lowered Eleanor's coffin into the ground for the final time, now properly marked and honored, Clara noticed Thunder standing apart from the other horses, his head bowed as if in mourning, or perhaps simply in acknowledgement that his task was complete. The horse had known something was wrong with that patch of ground, had sensed the unquiet presence of an unmarked grave, and had refused to ignore it. Without Thunder's persistence, Eleanor would have remained forgotten, her story untold, her love for Thomas unknown to history. After the ceremony, as guests shared a meal at the ranch house, James pulled Clara aside to the porch where they could watch the sun setting over the prairie. "You did something remarkable," he said quietly. "You gave voice to a woman who had been silenced, brought justice even though the guilty man was beyond earthly punishment. Eleanor and Thomas would be grateful if they could know what you accomplished." Clara shook her head. "We did this together. You never questioned my determination to pursue this, never suggested we should just let the past stay buried. And it was not just us. It was Mrs. Saunders keeping that letter for 20 years, Mrs. Walsh helping us access records, Thomas Hardwick documenting everything even though he thought no one would ever care. Everyone who touched this story helped bring Eleanor back into the light." The experience had changed Clara in ways she was still processing. She had started as a rancher's wife investigating a mystery on their property, but somewhere along the journey, she had become something else. An advocate for forgotten voices, perhaps, or simply someone who understood that truth mattered regardless of how much time had passed. She had already begun corresponding with other families who had questions about ancestors who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances in the early territorial days. There were so many untold stories, so many Eleanor Brennans whose fates deserved investigation and whose memories deserved preservation. As night fell over the prairie, Clara stood at the window of their bedroom looking out toward the cottonwood stand where Eleanor now rested beneath a proper monument. The grave would be maintained, visited, remembered. Local schools would bring children to learn about frontier justice and the courage it took to seek truth when institutions failed. Eleanor's story would be taught alongside other histories of the West, a reminder that behind every settlement and fort and territorial claim were individual human beings with hopes and fears and loves that mattered just as much as any battle or treaty. Thunder nickered softly from the barn, the sound carrying clearly through the quiet night. Clara smiled, thinking about the mysterious wisdom of animals, their ability to perceive things humans overlooked. The horse had led them to Eleanor for reasons that would always remain partially unknowable, but the result was undeniable. A wrong had been exposed, if not righted. A voice had been restored, if not revived, and love had been honored, even though the lovers themselves were long gone. James came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Ready to let this rest now?" he asked gently. Clara leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "Yes," she said softly. "Eleanor can rest now. Thomas can rest too, knowing the truth finally came out, and we can rest knowing we did right by both of them." Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the eternal song of the land and all the stories it held. Some of those stories would remain forever buried, but Eleanor Brennan's tale had been unearthed by a horse's persistent digging and a woman's relentless pursuit of truth. It was enough. It had to be enough. And in the grand accounting of justice, both earthly and eternal, perhaps it was more than enough.